Most people think that painting an army fast can only be done by sacrificing quality. Let's see if I can prove them wrong by painting the 30 ork troops in the Armageddon box to a high quality and only in about 1.5 hours per model. 2 weeks ago, I started a huge project in which I pledged to paint all the models in the Armageddon 11th edition starter set for Warhammer 40k and then put them on a huge diorama base. In the first video, I painted all 18 Space Marine troops in the box in less than 2 hours per model, using all the tricks I know to make things faster, but still maintain a high quality for the entire army. And I think they came out great, and a lot of you seem to agree with me based on the reactions to that video. Those were 18 models and that was already challenging enough, but now for the ork half I am facing 20 Boyz and 10 Grots. And they are fantastic models, deserving the same quality of paint job as the Space Marines or maybe even better. So if I want to do this in a reasonable amount of time, I need to really pull out all the stops. And here's the plan. I want these guys to have really striking green skin, it's kinda their signature thing after all. And paint them as Evil Sunz in red armor but with purple shirts because they don't only want to go fast, they want to be sneaky too. I also give them nice brown pants just in case old Bailey shows up. They don't scare easily, but better safe than sorry. And believe it or not, all 30 of them will get the full non-metallic metal treatment, just like the Space Marines. And I know that all of this sounds crazy in less than 2 hours per model, but I did have a plan and a lot of tricks up my sleeve. Did it go according to plan? Let's find out. First of all, I sprayed them all to be dark purple. Not necessarily to make them sneaky, but because this is a great shadow color for all the things I want to paint on them. The green skin, the red armor, obviously the purple shirts, and also the metals. And here's the first thing we can save time on. If I asked you where you can save the most time when painting 30 models, you would probably say it's the highlights, right? And I would tell you that sure, you can save a lot of time on highlights and we will do that too later, but what about the base coats? What if we could do the most important colors on the models in only a couple of hours instead of painstakingly painting them in with a brush one by one? So that is what I did by using an airbrush. First, I used a pretty standard 0.3mm needle and I sprayed in all the main colors, that is the green skin, the brown pants and the red armor. I tried to hit mostly the thing I wanted to spray, like the exposed skin for example, but I didn't mind if I also oversprayed a little on the things around it. These colors will serve as the shadow tones and later I will cover most of them with highlights anyway. I basically did a zenithal highlight on the elements, spraying mostly from above and at a slight angle. On the top of the volumes I covered everything fully, but on the bottom in the deepest shadows where the surface faces the ground, I left the purple mostly intact. On the Grots, it's quite difficult to not hit the other elements, but that is not a big issue because on these guys, green is the only color I did with the airbrush anyway. They are just too small for anything else. Now, one of the things most people tend to worry about a lot is where to put the highlights on the models, and what comes next helps me solve a large part of that issue. I switched to a smaller 0.2mm needle for this so I could be more accurate, but you can also do this with the standard 0.3 if you're careful. And I used brighter colors to highlight all the areas I had just base coated. Once again, I sprayed from a zenithal angle, but now I concentrated even more on the top of the elements, like the top of the muscles on the skin, for example. And what this gives me is basically a map that will show where the highlights should be. The spray of the airbrush hits the surface almost like light rays would, and it shows me where I should emphasize the highlights later and where things should remain darker because the light doesn't reach them. Is it perfect? Not at all, but it will serve us well enough for what we want to achieve here. And you will see that I will cover a lot of what I'm doing here later with the brush, but that is exactly why I'm doing it. It will give me a great base to work from, and the whole process took me less than 3 hours for the 30 models, which is not a lot in the grand scheme of things. Once I was done with this, I gave all the models a quick spray of satin varnish to protect the thin airbrush layers. This also allows me to easily wipe away any mistakes I might make later. And here we go, the Boyz have all their main colors base coated, but they are quite messy with colors where there shouldn't be any due to the overspray. So before I get to the real trick to speed up this paint job, I needed to clean up things a bit. I took some dark purple and I blocked in all the elements that were not supposed to have colors on them yet. And as you can see now, everything looks much tidier and you can tell where one color ends and the other begins. Okay, so at this point I felt pretty good. I spent only a little over 4 hours overall and the Boyz already looked quite colorful. Looking at them now, it might seem like this will take only a few more hours and we will be done, but if you've ever painted a lot of models, you probably know that things can be deceiving at this stage and the process slows down a lot from now on. So here's a question. What is it that slows down the process that much? Why is it that most people don't paint armies to a high standard using complicated techniques like non-metallic metal? And why do YouTubers usually paint only one or two beautiful models instead of a whole army when they show you a color scheme? Is it the edge highlights, the effects, the tiny details? Sure, all of those contribute, but there is one culprit above all else that prevents a whole army being painted to the quality you see on those single models. I can tell you, it's smoothness. Nothing will eat up your time as much as trying to achieve buttery smooth blends on your surfaces. But what if I told you that smoothness is overrated, and for most of us it's holding us back, actually making us paint worse looking models? You will see what I mean once I show you how I highlighted the main colors. So let's start with the skin first, because that is where I can't really get around making it at least somewhat smooth, so that's going to be our biggest challenge. But to be fair, I will be cheating. What I want to achieve is a super saturated and very striking green skin, but without using any kind of lengthy glazing, because that would take ages to achieve and I don't have that kind of time to burn here. The saturation and contrast I can achieve by using the right tones. I already have a transition from dark purple to a green thanks to what I did with the airbrush. Now I can improve that further by adding even brighter greens and finally yellow highlights. The trick for super saturated green skin is simply purple shadows, green midtones, and yellow highlights. It's that simple. I can simply follow the map I created with the airbrush and make smaller and smaller highlights until I reach a pure yellow in the end. I just have to avoid a very common mistake which most people make. It is very important to not leave the deeper areas between the muscles dark if they are aligned in a way that the light would hit them. If you leave them dark, you create outlines around the raised muscles which will make them look like islands, which is kind of weird and looks very unnatural. But what about that smoothness, you might ask? Well, I will do two things to get at least a semblance of smoothness on the skin. One, I'm using paint that is slightly more diluted than what I would usually use for layering. Not a glaze either, but something between the two. This will help it blend better with the airbrush layers. If the paint is too thick and opaque, it will create obvious brush marks which will stand out too much. The second thing I do, well, I cheat. When I am done with the highlights, I dilute the original base coat color and I spray it with the airbrush as a glaze, but this time from below, from the exact opposite direction than what I did originally. I sprayed this glaze mostly where the shadows meet the midtones to smooth out the transition, and because this is quite thin, I could build it up slowly without covering too much. I tried to keep the purple tones still intact, so I avoided spraying this in the deeper shadows. Here is a comparison shot of the same area before and after the glaze, and as you can see, the difference is not huge, but for something that takes barely any time at all to do, it is still quite significant. And the boys already look quite striking and high contrast only with the skin painted in. But now that I have the relatively smooth skin, I have zero reasons to make anything smooth anymore. In fact, I will actively avoid painting smooth things. Why? Because I want the smooth skin to contrast with all the non-smooth things around it. And how do you paint highlights on things without making smooth color transitions on them? You create textures. And I know that now a lot of you are thinking that textures are a high-level technique that only pro painters use, and how is that going to be faster than doing it the standard way? Well, contrary to popular belief, textures are actually quite easy and fast. A lot faster, in fact, than creating a smooth gradient with a brush. Let me show you. I started with the red armor, and I wanted it to look worn and beaten up because not only is smooth difficult, but it's also not very orky. First I painted every edge with the red, and then I made overlapping scratches where I wanted the highlights to be, basically on the top of the elements, inside where I sprayed the highlights with the airbrush. Where I wanted the highlight to be brighter, I added more scratches, and when I was done, I glazed over the middle with the same paint but very diluted. Then I switched to a brighter and more orangish tone, and I did the same, but now I only painted the scratches inside the previous red highlights, and I only painted the edges that were facing up towards the light. Finally, I used the almost yellow tone to paint only some of the edges on the top of the elements where they would catch the light the most. It is only random overlapping scratches, but it gives us nice volumetric highlights and we have an excuse for not making it smooth, it's just not supposed to be. By the way, this project has a lot of steps and quite a few paints to keep track of, so if you want to have everything in one place, I made a more than 100-page guide with all the steps, paints and explanations you will need to replicate what you see in this video. If that sounds like something you want, head over to my Patreon to get it. The link is in the video description. Okay, but what now? I use this fancy scratchy method, and if I use it again on something else, it will just look like the armor. So let's switch it up. I wanted the boys to have leather pants, which are also quite beaten up and worn looking, but in a different way than the armor. So instead of sketchy lines, I used little dots, a technique that you might know as stippling. But the idea is the same as before. I cover an area inside the highlights mapped out by the airbrush, but leaving some of the original color. In the middle, I make more overlapping dots to make the highlights more opaque and therefore brighter. Then I mix in a little of the lighter color and I do another set of stippled dots with the tip of the brush, but this time covering a smaller area. Finally, I did it again with the pure light flash color, now making the dots really small and in an even smaller spot inside what I did in the previous step. And to make the dots seem more part of the surface, I diluted the dark ochre a lot with water and I washed it over the surface, dragging it from the highlights and finishing the brush stroke in the shadows. Once again, this might seem complicated, but it was actually quite fast compared to doing the normal blending thing, and it produces a surface that looks very different from both the armor and the skin. But I had one more texture trick up my sleeve, so I painted the sneaky purple shirts to make them look like they are made of some kind of textile. First, I highlighted the raised elements of the shirt with the purple color. Then I started to mix in the yellowish flesh color and I used this to make a cross-hatching pattern with overlapping diagonal lines. I added more layers of brighter lines as I got closer to the top of the shirts, especially on the larger surfaces on the back. Then, to integrate the pattern and to add a little saturation and color, I used the thinned down king purple to wash over the whole surface, dragging it into the shadows and wiping it away from the brighter spots. Now let's take a quick breather here. All this texturing might be much faster than you might think, but even if something only takes 15 minutes per model, if you do it on 30 models, it will add up to more than 7 hours overall. So at this point I was already over 20 hours into this paint job and I started to feel the strain. If you are an army painter and you are used to painting dozens of models at the same time, you might be laughing at my puny 20 hours I pulled here. But I am a soft and lazy YouTuber who is used to painting only 1 or 2 models at the same time, and I could count on one hand how many times I spent more than 20 hours on a single project. So this is where I started to lose my resolve a little bit, and we haven't even reached the non-metallic metal yet, which I wasn't sure I can actually do on this many models. But I was eager to reach that stage and find out, so I quickly breezed through quite a few smaller elements with pretty standard methods. I painted the leather bits, making sure to use very different colors from the ones I used on the pants to make them as distinct as possible. I painted all the skulls, the claws and the teeth, so all the boys can have their nice, charming, toothy smiles. And I painted the eyes with a pretty simple method so I can easily replicate it across 30 models. I dotted in the eyes with white paint and I painted fluorescent orange over it. And that brings us to the big bad non-metallic metal. Now most people think that non-metallic metal has to be very complicated, and it can be, but it doesn't have to be. If I wanted to make this happen, I had to resort to something that is admittedly a pretty crude but effective way to paint corroded metal that can be replicated super fast on multiple models. To give you an idea, an ork boy took me about 20 minutes to complete, a grot a little less than 15, and a knob about 30-35. It is not smooth, but it's orks, so it doesn't have to be. But to make up for it, it's fast, high contrast and high impact, and this is how you do it. First, I covered about 80% of the surface with the dark reddish brown, only leaving the purple in the deepest shadows where things were facing away from the light. Then I used the greenish brown color to cover about 80% of that, plus I highlighted all the edges. In the areas where the dark brown was visible, I made a lot of random scratches with the tip of the brush. This makes the area more interesting and worn looking, plus it hides the transition between the colors because we don't have time for smoothing with glazes. These brown tones are probably not the first colors that come to your mind when you think of steel or iron. But we are painting orks here, not space marines. Their weapons should be filthy, corroded and worn looking, which is the reason behind my color choices. Ultimately, non-metallic metal can be done with almost any color, depending on what effect you are going for, but if you want to represent something resembling steel or iron, at some point you have to resort to some gray colors tending towards white. So for the next step, I did the same with a bluish-gray color, but now covering an even smaller area and only painting the edges facing up. And this is the step which takes actually the longest. The first brownish color I can simply overbrush on the surface, hitting all the raised elements. I don't need to paint any details there, I just need to cover the surface. The second one is similar but on a smaller scale, but I need to paint the edges and pay attention to the larger details, so it takes a little longer. But this gray color is where I need to pay the most attention. This will be very visible, so the edge highlights need to be crisp. The sketches need to be thin, and it's very important to only paint the edges that would be hit by the light. Compared to this, the last step is only a couple of minutes. With the very bright gray, I highlighted only the most prominent edges, plus I added a couple of scratches in the most well-lit areas. Sure, this has to be thin and crisp, even more so than the previous one, but the area I cover is so small and the edges I paint so few that it takes no time at all. And to spice it up, when I was done, I thinned down this rust color to a glazed consistency and I dropped it into some of the corners of the metal. In some places where there was enough space for it, I glazed it onto the surface, dragging it from the midtones into the shadows and letting it pool there. This helps smooth things out a bit and also adds a quick rust effect. And this is how the Boyz looked after all the metal was painted in. The metal bits took me over 10 hours to complete, so I won't show you how my face looked in the end, you can probably imagine. Was it worth it though? I would say yes, but you can agree or disagree with me in the comments. And of course, if you want to replicate this scheme and you want to use normal metals, you can do that too, I won't hold it against you. But now I just had to paint in some of the remaining small details like the ammunition, some extra details on the knobs and even some mini squigs on some of the models. I didn't paint the bases because all of these are supposed to go on a large diorama once everything in the box is painted, so that will serve as their base. But after about 45 hours of work, the end result looks like this. So, can you paint an army to a high standard using textures and non-metallic metal in a reasonable amount of time, and is it worth it? Well, I can certainly see why most YouTubers stick to painting only a couple of models, but then I look at my really cool horde of orks and I think the answer is yes to both. But let me know what you think in the comments. But I am not done yet. Keep an eye out for the next video in the series in which I will be painting the Space Marine characters from the Armageddon box. If you found this video useful, do me a solid and subscribe, like and comment, it really helps the channel out. And check out my Patreon for some awesome painting guides and long-form painting videos. And as usual, before I sign off, I wanted to thank my Patreon members for all their support. Without them, this channel wouldn't exist, and that is especially true for the ones in the captain level. Thank you guys, see you in the next one.